The American Revolution, in other words, is never finished. It must always be renewed.
Greater love than this hath no man, than that he lay down his life for his friend.
What if it's not envy?
We must take back our cities, and take back our culture, and take back our country. God bless you, and God bless America.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Orin. Glad to have you here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You have an Auron Macintyre show, right? Who are you again? Why don't you fill us in?
In case nobody knows.
Why are you here?
Yeah.
I've run a show over on The Blaze, the Auron Macintyre show. It's on all the podcast platforms, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, and Blaze TV. Obviously, I've also got a column over at The Blaze that you can check out, Substack, and the book that I think we're going to be touching on, The Total State.
Yeah,
Right
The
over
Total
here.
State.
Yeah.
This is such a good book because I think a lot of us have gone through this this long journey, right, away from liberalism, under whatever name you want to call it. And there's a lot of things that are entailed by liberalism. You could include universalism and just sort of the blueprint approach to politics rather than the realist approach to politics. And what that came out with, from your perspective and our perspective as well, is in the name of freedom, we wound up with this sort of entrenched bureaucratic totalitarianism, but all of it was done in the name of human rights and democracy and popular sovereignty and all the things that we grew up with. And I think people have a hard time wrapping their head around this, that it was actually the rhetorical universe of freedom that actually wound up causing our bureaucratic managerialism, that you kind of get into detail about how that works. I mean, would you say that's a fair assessment of what's going on? There's this massive chasm between the rhetorical myths that operate in people's minds, and we basically live under the thumb of the largest, most totalizing state in world history. And can you make sense of that for us? Like, we tell ourselves it's all about freedom, that's what America's for, and yet on the other side of the scale, there's actually no aspect of our life that's free anymore. Can you kind of put that together for us?
Sure. Interesting thing when writing this book was I was, like, as you pointed out, a lot of us are on this journey. And so I don't think that the book necessarily is one singular thing so much as the experience that a lot of people have had as they've looked at the experiences over the last few years when it came to COVID, lockdowns, other excesses of the government that we've seen, the failures of these major institutions. And we talk about the land of the free, the home of the brave. We are the most free people in human history. America is all about freedom, freedom, freedom. And yet we live in a state where people can shut down your church, shut down your business, lock you in your house, try to force you to take an experimental vaccine. And these two things can't possibly be true simultaneously. And I think, ultimately, the book looks at new causes, but also old truths that we have both, I think, found, that all of us talking here have discovered, that there's simultaneously a certain aspect of modernity that drives us towards these giant bureaucracies that consume many of our freedoms, but also some of the most ancient lessons throughout philosophy, religion, sociology, history, which is that people who abandon virtue lose their true freedom, their true liberty, really, I think is the appropriate word. Over time, we have watched the state step in. It now educates our children, takes care of our parents, makes sure that our destitute niece doesn't go homeless. It does all these things that we used to have to do, that were big parts of the intermediate institutions that we evolved ourselves in: the church, the family, the tribe, the fraternal organization. These things that really tied America together in what Alexis de Tocqueville called the intermediate institutions that stood between us and government. And Alexis de Tocqueville gets quoted all the time by conservatives saying, oh, well, it's these intermediate institutions that keep the government in check, that keep the government from growing and becoming totalitarian. And of course, that's true. But what they don't read is the next part of that same chapter where de Tocqueville talks about those institutions and says, and the reason that these institutions are so important is that it solves America's individualism problem. He looked at America and he said, actually, one of the things that the upsides and the downsides of America is it's very individualistic. So people will look to set out to solve problems. But the good thing about America is that they solve these problems by forming voluntary associations. But if at any point they stop forming these involuntary associations, then the individualism aspect will eventually cause very, very serious issues in the United States. And that's what we're seeing now. We thought we were becoming freer because we allowed the government to do all these things for us. I don't have to take care of these extended relatives. I don't have to take care of my neighbor. I don't have to take care of my community. But what we ended up doing is giving government more and more power every time we did that. So the state became more total as we became more liberated from our social institutions, our social responsibilities. And so, again, there's new technology that enables this. There's, I think, political science that's relatively unexplored that helps us to better understand this phenomenon. So that's kind of the new part of the book. But the most ancient part of the book is the stuff that Aristotle told us, that ultimately virtue is about acting in communities and taking responsibility for ourselves. That's ultimately what restrains the power of government, not something we wrote down on paper.
That phrase total state that you used for the book title, that comes from somewhere specific. I mean, you talked about new contours of exploration in political science, but that phrase itself comes from Carl Schmitt. So let's start with Carl Schmitt. Like I think nobody's allowed to talk about Carl Schmitt, but he is the thinker of the age.
Yeah.
He is the one that critiqued the 20th century and where it was all going. So what lessons do you draw from him, and why do you use him as, for the title of your book?
Yeah, Schmitt is obviously very important. I actually spend a lot more time on people like Bertrand de Juvenal, but they're like, moderate classical liberals, so they're not as controversial. No one cares about the fact that I draw most of my stuff from non-controversial people. It's much spicier to talk about Carl Schmitt. But Carl Schmitt is still critical. You're right to point this out. And really, Schmitt's point when he coined the phrase the total state was that once democracy, once the political pierced every aspect of society, at some point, politics was over here, and it affected, of course, lots of things. But the idea that every aspect of life would be oriented towards acquiring and wielding political power was not really a thing through most of history. But as popular sovereignty, as the will of the people became the mechanism by which we validated state power, it became more and more important to gather that will, to secure that will, to make sure that it was always working in the manner that you wish, which meant that the democratic process, the political process, needed to be involved in every aspect of society. And so once the personal and political breached each other, once the constant need to control political opinion, to control public understanding, breached into homes, families, communities, churches, every aspect of life, dating, it doesn't matter. Everything is about your politics. Everything is about, do you have the correct opinions? Are you ideologically aligned? Are you pushing the current narrative? That's all that matters. Once that permeated every aspect of society, we get the total state, because when the state's power rests on its ability to manipulate public opinion, well, public opinion is forged at every level of society. It's forged pre-politically even. So we need to eliminate the pre-political in things like the family so that the political can completely permeate, can completely be controlled by the state. And so the total state is the one in which the state recognizes its need to reach into every single social interaction, every job hiring, every firing, every marriage, every childbirth, every educational institution. That's what creates the total state.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, you mentioned Schmitt, and you mentioned I think you have Sam Francis in there and some others. I mean, why don't people recognize them as legitimate thinkers that have contributed to describing our problem? Like, the people that you get into Burnham and you get into others, these people have been neglected. Why do you think that is? And why do you think so many younger people, like all three of us, are excited to explore these untapped areas? Like, why do they speak so well to our current age?
Well, again, it really just depends on which of the thinkers you're talking about. If we're talking about someone like Schmidt, obviously his association with the National Socialist Party makes him very taboo, even though the left has been reading him for actually quite a long time. And he's been acknowledged as someone who's critical in jurisprudence, despite his political affiliations at a particular time in history. We also have guys like Sam Francis. He is someone who ended up having controversial views on race, and so therefore he's inadmissible in many of these discussions. Guys like Burnham were founding the National Review. This is a guy who's a CIA asset. I mean, he should be relatively discussable. I mean, if Buckley is, then you would think that Burnham would also be someone that you can reference, and yet we see that he is often pushed aside, I think, for the most part, because his analysis lays things too bare. They're too obvious. They're too honest. I've had the ability now to discuss with several people who've written for the National Review about James Burnham, and for the most part, most of them just didn't know much about him. There's just a lacuna in the knowledge, even of people who are professional, who are working at the organization he helped to found. Just they're very unfamiliar. The same thing when I interacted with conservative intellectuals when it came to political science. Very few of them were read on Burnham. The managerial elite, they had very little familiarity. It's a lot of de Tocqueville. And look, I just quoted de Tocqueville. I like de Tocqueville, but like political science, there's more. Like it's not the only only conservative outlook you can have. Someone like Joseph de Maistre, another French author who I think had very deep insights about the American experience, but is somebody who's counted more as a reactionary. This guy is a devoted Catholic and a monarchist, and so perhaps doesn't work into the normal avenues of American political thought. I think we've seen a lot of guys, even someone like Russell Kirk, who is really, he literally wrote the book on conservative thought, but even he has been pushed to the side for the most part. You still have guys like Ben Shapiro being like, Russell Kirk, he's probably got something valuable to say. But they never reference him. They never actually bring forward any of his ideas. We kind of always just get this really, really strange Reaganite snapshot of a civics class from the 1980s. And that is pretty much the only level of thought we get from the vast majority of political punditry.
I think the reason people don't refer to like Russell Kirk or James Burnham is because one thing that they have in common, and they are actually worlds apart in a lot of their instincts and in all the cultural instincts and things like that. But one of the reasons people don't quote them a lot, we don't hear a lot about them, is because they were much more particularistic, right? They didn't adhere to this universalist mythos that the post-war consensus really needs in order to justify its actions, especially in the 80s and the 90s. Like Reaganism, if anything, is a universalist approach to politics, where there's these natural rights that exist for all time, and they are not distinct to any particular peopled community with a heritage, but they actually are transcendent over those things. And Burnham rejects that view. I mean, he's very much a situationalist in terms of his politics, and Russell Kirk is much more of a patrimonialist, if you could say it that way. So these are approaches that basically are outside the purview of what the post-war consensus needed to push its paradigm into the Western Hemisphere after World War II. So that's kind of what I would say to that. It's like, it's not just the controversial things like Sam Francis and Carl Schmitt, but it's also, you can't operate a universalist empire, an ideological empire, if a lot of the components of your civil society, like Russell Kirk would put forth, are grounded in a unique peopled experience.
Yeah, I want to be clear, because it's become somewhat fashionable at this point in our circles to kind of like, reconstruct the Reagan presidency to dunk on it, pretty handily. And I do think that there's some value in, returning Reagan back to humanity. Maybe he doesn't need to be deified. Perhaps Caesar is not actually divine in this case. However, I do think people are a little hard on Reagan, only because we have to recognize the geopolitical situation that we were in, whether people want to recognize this or not. We were in an arms race with a global power that could wipe out all of humanity. Really glad that didn't happen, but that's a existential struggle that we just kind of pretend didn't happen the minute we're not subject to it. Like, people really were drilling and hiding under desks in case they ended up getting, obliterated by a bomb. Like these were real concerns that people had. And how do you defeat a giant globalistic ideology that's conquering large chunks of Europe and Asia? You come up with your own giant global ideology, right? Like you need
Yeah.
this narrative of the free West against, the despotic Soviet Union. And of course, comparatively, the West was freer and the Soviet Union was despotic. So I think we should recognize that what we ended up in was a real, true mimetic war, like a war of ideologies that was incredibly powerful, that literally had the entire globe threatened. We could have all died pretty easily if a few things had gone wrong without God's providence, protecting us. And so ultimately, while I think that a lot of damage came out of many of the globalizing aspects of the Reagan presidency that you're discussing, ultimately this was a man of his time and in his place trying to solve a problem that none of us will ever need to solve. Right? We'll never face that kind of existential threat from an empire that literally could wipe humanity off the face of the earth. So recognizing that perhaps that was necessary, or perhaps it seemed necessary at the time. It seemed like the only way, in the same way that Nixon opening China, putting daylight between China and the Soviet Union, ultimately probably saved certain amount of geopolitical disaster, even though ultimately we are now paying the price for that, right? With China and its rise and the trade problems we have with China. So it's a very complicated situation in a giant world of high stakes geopolitics. But ultimately, whether it was the right move or the wrong move, you're correct that the aftermath of the globalization of that movement still sits at the heart of much of what is considered mainstream conservatism, which is itself, whether it recognizes it or not, a globalistic ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Since you brought it up, I have to comment. Sometimes I'll have people be like, well, why do you have this, Nixon poster, up there? Don't you know he's responsible for opening up China and all of the all the problems with that and what we're suffering now. I mean, you even mentioned it in your book when you're talking about 2020 and the supply chain and the virus comes out of China, and then everything everything we need, all the medical supplies and pharmaceuticals and everything are made there, and we're stuck, right? And that lesson was not clearly learned. But like you said, you're in the context of this truly existential struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and had that not been done, if Nixon had not gone to China, right, the Soviet Union would have won, right? Like that's just the reality. Like we wouldn't even be talking about Reagan and how wonderful or conservatives wouldn't be talking, for the last 40 years about how wonderful Ronald Reagan is and how great he is, because like we just would have lost. And so we need to have monuments to Ronald Reagan in DC, or rather to Richard Nixon in DC, a giant statue. Maybe replace the Lincoln Memorial with Nixon. I don't know. It's a suggestion. But Orin, I think something that your book does is puts into words the things that many of the conclusions that people our age and especially younger have realized, because you listen to conservative pundits, you read conservative writers for our entire lifetimes, and it's always, we just need to get back to the Constitution. Right? We just need to have the Constitution again, and this veneration for the Constitution, as if it's still in existence, right? As if the constitutional order of 1787 or even the constitutional order of 1865 is still extant. And people our age realize like that just simply is not true. I mean, I think for me, the first moment I like truly realized this was when the like Obamacare, it's clearly like just patently unconstitutional to have an appropriations bill originate in the United States Senate, which is what Obamacare was. And it should have just been immediately struck down by the Supreme Court. And it, of course, wasn't, right? Because it's very politically popular. And so this illusion of, oh, we still have a constitution, like, was just immediately shattered for me. And then you see everything else that has occurred since then. You look into the things that have occurred in the decades that preceded that, and it's like, no, this has been gone for a very long time. And you see it like CJ talks about Garrett Garrett and the revolution within the forms, right? So the facade of constitutional order, the facade of a democratic republic is still there, but behind the scenes, the entire edifice has been reconstructed and just simply no longer exists whatsoever. And the hard thing is, right, when we make that argument, or you make that argument, or guys like us make that argument, you have all of these people, I'll name him, like James Lindsay, for example, that are like, you guys are woke, right? You're trying to subvert the Constitution. You're trying to tear down our constitutional order. These guys are bad. They hate America. They hate the Constitution. And it's like, no, I actually don't. I love our country deeply. I actually love our country way more than you do, James Lindsay. I love the Constitution way more than you do, James Lindsay. And I love it so much, I'm not going to play Weekend at Bernie's with it anymore. Right. You just have this dead corpse that you're pretending is still alive. And I'm not going to play those games. I'm not going to pretend the emperor has clothes when he clearly does not. And so, I mean, there's a question here, actually. Do you think,
Questions behind the paywall.
That's right.
After the pre-session.
Yeah, we're 23 minutes in. We're maybe
The
past
first
the
half
paywall
of the interview is just me listening.
me talking.
Yes,
That's
wise.
right. But the question here is, right? Do you see the coming generation of young politically aware men? Do you see them as mostly fully conscious of this reality and beginning to act politically within that context, right? Do you see that happening? And so and if so, right, what is that going to look like over the next 20 or 30 years?
This ends the free access portion of the interview. For the full 90-minute discussion, please go to contramundumpod.com/premium and sign up for any of the support tiers. There you can find the links for the full conversation and get access to our Appeal to Heaven show. All this content requires financial resources, and we are grateful for everyone willing to pitch in. See you on the other side.